I think he was hiding. I think he waited till we fell asleep and then murdered JONBENET.
Ramsey says there are 7 items from the crime scene that still need to be tested, including the garrote and a rope found in a guest bedroom.
The paintbrush and string are the ground zero of this case. In mid-August 1997, about 8 months after the incident, the Denver Post described Patsy's paintbrush as the murder weapon. It also provided a crucial detail here that the autopsy photograph shows cord wrapped 7 times around the paintbrush handle. It described it as spotted with royal blue and black paint. Now think of that headline in isolation, just on its own, that a paintbrush was the murder weapon. The thing that killed JONBENET Ramsey was a paintbrush. Not a garrote, not a flashlight, not a golf club. If you knew nothing about this case and merely accepted that a paintbrush killed JONBENET and that it was Patsy's paintbrush, would your first thought really be that an intruder had killed JONBENET? Really? He brings a stun gun but uses a flimsy little stick for the coup de grace. The key to figuring out what happened, why, how, and who was involved could well lie right here, by seeing the paintbrush as a paintbrush. When the coroner arrived at the Ramsey home to find JONBENET deceased on the living room floor, one of the first things he noticed was the lacquered stick and string lying on the carpet. The coroner described the contraption as having a knot almost like a noose and a broken stick on one end. According to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Mayer, that's the coroner, and his chief investigator Patricia Dunn noted the ligature around the child's neck and around one wrist. The cord around her neck had been pulled through a knot almost like a noose, and a broken lacquered stick was tied to one end. In his autopsy report, Mayer also described a double knot. It was actually up to the coroner to remove this cord, and so he would have examined the cord and seen the knot and this paintbrush stick up close. In the coroner's 9-page autopsy report, guess how many times the coroner, the man who saw how the cord was used, what it did, and actually handled and untangled it himself, guess how many times he used the term garrote? 0. Not one reference in 9 pages. So who called it a garrote?
I suppose it's not 100% convincing.
It's not 1% convincing.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this analysis, we're going to look at the paintbrush, we're going to look at the knot, and we're going to try and think about all of this in a way that we haven't before. Is that possible to have an original thought about this case in 28 years? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, thank you very much to Angela for your review left on the 21st of December. Critical thinking needed. Thanks very much for that 5-star review. She writes, Nick does an excellent job asking the reader to consider this and that. His books are amazing. Thanks very much for that, Angela. If you've read Christmas Star and you leave a review, I'll be happy to post it over here as well. You're welcome also to post questions or comments in your review, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll put a link to Christmas Star in the description if you're interested in reading it yourself. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So if it's not a garrote, the knot on this device can and does tell us what it really is. And where does that take us? Well, first of all, let's recall how we got here. Thus far in this analysis, we've looked at 2 possible sources for our knot on the paintbrush: rock climbing and sailing. Now we want to investigate the likelihood that the knot, the hitch, might come from another source, a different fabric. How about scouts? Do you think it does? I've identified 10 prescient points to do with the scout narrative. In this analysis, we'll look at the first 5, and we'll deal with the remaining 5 in a sort of part 2 to this analysis. Number 1, thought experiment. What if the garrote is not a garrote? Instead of going into the archive of scouting knots, which is quick and easy to do, I can open a book and show you. I can take you to the index and show you that. I want to challenge your thinking on old information without the benefit or the juxtaposition of new information. In other words, I want to try and encourage you to change your thinking without showing you exactly why. In other words, before we get to the finish line of that argument. And so what this question asks is, are you able to reform an opinion without being shown why you should? In other words, can you intellectually reason your way into changing your own mind?
So I guess we'll just see, won't we?
The Ramsey case in some instances is an IQ test. In other instances, it's a ego test. So if you say the garrote is a garrote, you're not necessarily wrong. Maybe it fits a general definition. But what happens when you follow the theory through to its logical conclusion? That is also a measure of intelligence. Because we ought to do both here. We ought to imagine the implications of a garrote fit for purpose, fit for design, and then imagine a scenario that the garrote might not be a garrote and see how each hypothesis stands up against one another. Which hypothesis, given all the other information, makes the most sense? And how much stamina do we have to be able to concentrate through these scenarios? Are we patient enough to patiently problem solve and think critically through this sort of quagmire of information? And it's quite an interesting test because you probably have similar, somewhat complicated situations to deal with in your own life. So if you're able to deal with this one, maybe you'll be able to deal with that, especially in the coming year, 2025. Now, just one example of thinking it through. Why does a fully grown adult need a device like this if his purpose is to kill a child much smaller than himself? He doesn't need it. He certainly doesn't need the stick. And even if he wants to use a stick, why break both ends off of it? Have you ever considered that? Why do you need to break the ends off of it when it just needs to function temporarily just that night for its purpose? And this isn't just dry, silly speculation. JONBENET was struck a hard blow onto the top of her head. Why is there that and the garrote? The garrote shouldn't be necessary, or if it is, the hard blow shouldn't be. So, is it a garrote? According to a narrow technical definition, yes, it's a garrote. Someone posted a comment, a garrote is anything used for strangulation purpose. It is still called this even though it's not the original version with handles, right? And so my response to that is, so if a tie is used, is it a garrote or a tie? And what I'm saying is, if you have a tie in your wardrobe and that is used as a garrote, is that tie now no longer a garrote? Was that tie made to garrote someone? Is it a garrote or a tie? And someone responded by saying, I just looked up the definition. It says a piece of rope or wire used for strangulation purposes. Now just think about where we are. We are 28 years later, and people are saying, well, they are looking up the meaning of garrote for the first time essentially in 28 years. It's good to do, but that is how you can get that first note wrong, by not being clear about what something is and what something isn't. And then also, if we apply the broader context, you'll see that it looks less and less like a garrote, but we have to be willing to go down that path in order to see it. Are you? We're almost at 9 minutes. We are almost at the limit of a lot of people's attention spans. And I'm only about to begin making my argument. Right, so do you agree if the garrote is a garrote, it denotes a serious type of offender, an adult male, and a very serious crime, a sickening crime against a 6-year-old. But what if the garrote isn't a garrote? Well, then it denotes a less serious type of offender, not necessarily an adult, not necessarily male or female, and also a less serious type of offense. And often in true crime, people don't want to hear it. They want to hear the most extreme, the most shocking story. And if a device did something it wasn't supposed to do, and this really needs to be emphasized, imagine that something was made and something happened. and it did something it wasn't supposed to do, then JonBenet's death was an accident. Think about a swimming pool as a device that does something it's not supposed to do. You're supposed to have fun in a swimming pool, not drown in it. A swimming pool wasn't constructed for people to drown in it. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, we can only know if the device did something it wasn't supposed to do if we know what it actually is and what it was for. So a lot rides on whether the garrote is a garrote and whether it was designed and used for that purpose. Well, how do we get there? That brings us to number 2. If it is a garrote and a garrote designed to be a garrote, the ransom note makes no sense. And this is kind of an intellectual argument even before we get to dealing with the garrote. If you say it's a garrote, then the intruder spent around half an hour writing a practice note in the Ramsey home. People have done experiments of this, rewriting the Ramsey ransom note by hand. Some have said if you just do it quickly, it'll take about 22 minutes. But of course, there was a practice note, and if you're going to disguise your handwriting, it might take even longer. But then, after spending that length of time writing the note, the intruder also spent Lord knows how much time, besides writing the note, fashioning the garrote. So let me get this straight. Did he write the 3-page note before JonBenet and her family arrived home, then constructed the garrote to garrote JonBenet? But then he didn't want to kidnap her or ransom her. He wanted to kill her. And so how does that make sense? Do you see the premeditated ransom note and the premeditated garrote? A garrote made in order to perform as a garrote are mutually destructive. That is how easy it is for a false note to create a fallacious argument and ruin the whole symphony. Now, for this analysis to be of any real benefit to you, you might need to do something you rarely do or perhaps never do on the Ramsey case. You need to open your mind, be curious to additional possibilities. I hope I've started that process. I mean, you do want to solve this case, right? To do that, we need to explore cognitive pathways that others have ignored, and the garrote not being a garrote is just one of those. Well, are you prepared to try? That's all I'm asking. You don't need to change your mind. Just try. Just take the first step.
You have to let it all go, Neo. Free your mind.
So if you break whatever is anchoring your mind into this thinking about the garrote and you ask yourself, what is a garrote? Well, the definition is someone who kills by strangulation, especially with a length of wire or cord, right? Well, I've got a white phone charging cable on my desk. Is it a phone charging cable or a garrote? Also, the black cord connecting my mouse to my laptop, is that a garrote? Have you, in your experience, ever purchased a garrote in your life? Have you ever made a garrote in your life? I hope not. Have you ever seen a garrote in your life? Now, it may seem like a stupid question, but it's one thing to design a garrote to be a garrote. It's another thing to say that someone was garroted, and then by inference, the thing that was used was a garrote. Think about, for example, someone is in a car accident, and they have difficulty with the safety belt, and it ends up actually garroting them in some bizarre fashion. Is it a safety belt or a garrote? No, of course it's a safety belt. Same thing with the parachute cord. That's something that almost happened to me. When I went skydiving, I was almost garroted by the cord of a parachute. And so does that mean that is a garrote? No, it's still a parachute. Again, do you see, this is where an off note could send you completely in the wrong direction. And so the question is, what we see in the crime scene, very simple question, is this a typical garrote? This is what a typical garrote looks like. This is what the wooden paintbrush and cord look like. They may be similar, but they aren't the same. So the answer is no, it's not a typical garrote. You can call it a garrote, but then you should also add that qualification. It's not really a typical garrote. It's a one-handled garrote. And so already you're moving away from your own definition. Also, if you're going to use a handle, if you're determined to use a handle, look how thick and sturdy a conventional handle is on a garrote. Who would use a flimsy pencil or paintbrush? the width less than that of your pinky, on something involving such strong forces. I mean, there was a Swiss Army knife just a few yards away. Why not use that as a handle? So again, what is it? What is it that we're dealing with? And I think the clue to this, the vital clue to telling us what it is number 3, what type of knot is it? Can the knot tell us one way or the other what sort of person made the knot? And this is where we've got to be very, very careful, because in this area, if one note is off, we head completely in the wrong direction. Should we head to the Boulder Climbing Center? Should we head to Charlevoix or Lake Michigan? Should we head into the fabric of Scouts? Should we head to someone who is fishing in a nearby river? So we must think our way very delicately through this part of the Ramsey puzzle. We're about 15 minutes in. Would you like to hear my opinion on this? My opinion is that the knot on the garrote isn't a sailor's knot, although sailors do employ similar knots. So what is it? And who are we really dealing with here? In my opinion, the knot on the paintbrush is known as a hitch. In the most basic sense, the knot on the paintbrush isn't just a knot, it's a knot tied to an object, in this case a stick, something made of wood, which makes it already a very specialized kind of knot. A hitch knot is a type of knot used to secure a rope to an object or another rope. Sailors don't generally tie knots to small sticks while out on the open sea or when docking. They do often tie knots to cleats or to guardrails, fixed objects that are in turn fixed to something else, the boat or a mooring point attached to a harbor wall. That is not what we're dealing with here. But the Ramsey knot is a knot attached to a free-floating stick. So, in the most general sense, I'd say we are talking about a hitch knot or just a hitch. Good, we're making progress. So now the question is, what type of hitch is this? And what area are hitches associated with? To further complicate matters, many of the same knots taught in sailing are taught to scouts. Knots taught in fishing, camping, and climbing overlap as well. Again, the key area here is that there's a little stick on the end. Incidentally, if you really want to think the knot narrative through to its completion, well, the back of paintings also often have, the frames have pieces of strings tied to hooks. So, especially in the old days. So yes, Patsy probably also tied a knot or two. Most of us have in our lives at some point or another. But for the sake of clarity, even if this type of knot is taught in sailing to sailors, and it is it taught to scouts? And that little piece of wood on the end gives us the answer. Yes, this isn't just a knot, it's a knot with a stick, and you see this all the time in scouts. Number 4, if the knot with a stick is atypical of any sailing device, then where does it come from? Cords and knots tied to timber are common, as I say, in scouts and in camping. Camping is also something scouts often do. The nylon cord used on JONBENET looks a lot like the rigging used to lash down tents. Now we could go into that area, like what kind of cord are we dealing with here, and does the cord associate more with mountaineering, sailing, or scouts or camping? But we're not going to go into that area because we're dealing just here about the knot and the stick, okay? But there was a guy called Van Tassel, an expert, who was called to basically comment, give his expert testimony. I think he was a Canadian, on this particular aspect. And that brings us to the 5th and final point. I'll resume with part 2, the other 5 points following this analysis. What is it? What is this thing that we're looking at? Not just the knot, but the knot, the string, and the loop on the end, right? I'm not sure that this knot neatly fits any specific definition. I've got an idea, just the knot though. I've got an idea that the whole thing, the whole construction does. And I'm going to show you an example of that and ask you whether this thing is more like this thing or the garrote. In the simplest of terms, the paintbrush device was a timber hitch on the one end and a slip knot on the other. A slip knot is a term Kohler often uses. Slip knots are relatively simple to do. Have a look. So we approaching our cutoff time for concentration spans. I mean, typically it's less than 10 minutes, so I've gone twice that length of time. Those of you who have stayed here till the end, thank you very much. We will identify certainly what I think this whole contraption is. in the second part of part 5, What Is It?, in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.